welcome to the April 24th, 2023 City Council Work Session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And thank you again for joining us. And with that, I call this work session to order, and I will turn it over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. This work session is really just a continuation of an earlier one you had on prohibited camping, and I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, who's going to lead, and I think Matt's here to answer questions.
Yes, I have Rodriguez, Public Works Director.
Certified smart person. It's used
Exactly.
Alan's terms.
She's here to help. And Denny Rose on virtual, and I'm expecting Chief Skinner to also be showing up either here or remotely. So good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for having me back again to talk about this topic. This is the third work session in what I'd like to call a series of work sessions that are leading us up to May 15th. So May 15th will be your public hearing date on an ordinance. And so our goal here today is, I'll just skip to that. Our goal here today is really to get an ordinance in a spot where that is the one you want to have a public hearing on May 15th. So that's what we're driving toward today. And whether it's the one that's in your packet or that one's tweet, all good, but we're driving to an ordinance that you want to put out for public hearing on May 15th. So just real quick, and I see Chief Skinner, he's here to answer questions as well. Yay. So at your last work session, which was on March 8th, what you had in your packet and what you primarily spent your time discussing was an outline of proposed code amendments. And I described those code amendments to our prohibited camping code provision and some related code provisions as really following into three main categories to address three main issues: accessibility, public health, and safety. And so all of the proposed code amendments that you were looking at and the description of them really fell into one of those three categories. So attachment A to your AIS is a draft ordinance that has those proposed code amendments captured in as an ordinance. And so just real quick reminder, what you'll find in that ordinance is, so real quick, we'll just go through the three categories. The accessibility, what you have, there are some provisions that prohibit camping if you can't have minimum widths to allow for accessibility for all of our citizens, including those with disabilities. And so you have a 4-foot and a 10-foot width, depending on the type of facility we're working with. And then regarding health, you have some prohibitions in there first, and we'll talk more about these to protect our waterways and what was previously proposed and now what you find in your ordinance, which is a much more expanded protection of our waterways to address the health and safety issues there, as well as some provisions around open sewage, discharging sewage, and things like that that are getting within our systems, our stormwater systems and our other systems that have an impact on health as well. And then lastly, regarding safety, the proposed ordinance includes some provisions that prohibit camping and establishing campsites within areas that are typically where you're going to find vehicular travel. So either directly within the travel or very, very close to vehicular travel. And so depending on the area we're talking about, it's either outright prohibited, such as within a travel lane or with an on-site parking spot, or within a certain number of feet of where you're going to find vehicular travel to keep everyone safe, prevent people if a curb gets jumped, things like that. So that's what those are. So at your work session on March 8th, you discussed those, and then you had some specifically requests for me when we came back for this third work session. So the first was, and a lot of your discussion was around the waterways and how to better protect the waterways. The proposal of the 5 feet setback from the waterways was unacceptable to all of you. And so that's not what is in that proposed ordinance. What you have in your proposed ordinance are 3 different setbacks from waterways: 100-foot top of high bank, 60 feet top of high bank, and then 5 feet if it's a natural vegetative stormwater facility. And so depending on the facility or the type of waterway, that's why you have the varying footage backwards. So the other thing you have is some specific language that addresses the code amendments they're in your they're in your AIS, and those are some additional code amendments that had been requested by other counselors that weren't talked about or in my outline. And so I didn't embed them within the ordinance, but you have them in your AIS. I wanted to have them teed up so you could talk about them. If the majority of you want them to make their way into the ordinance, that's all ready. And you can discuss it and you can make those motions if you want. And then lastly, I think, so I already set up what I'd like for today. If we can leave here and you've got an ordinance that you would like to go to public hearing, that's our goal. To have the hearing on May 15th, which is really when we need to have the hearing, your charter requires that we publish on our website no later than this Friday, the full text of the ordinance. So that's why we're driving there. That's where we need to get to today. And obviously, if whatever goes to public hearing on the 15th, you can still change it. So it is not as though you're voting on the ordinance today. It is simply to move an ordinance to the May 15th public hearing. And you will be listening to public testimony, take that public testimony account, and you can always make changes as well. So that's all I have, Mayor, and we're here to answer questions and whatever we can do to help you have a discussion today about the proposed ordinance. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful and a reminder of where we have been and how we got to this place. So I am just going to open the floor. I have Jennifer, Randy, Alan. There you go. Take it away, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thanks again. I think this makes a lot of sense to me. I just have a question. I think it makes a lot of sense to make sure our sidewalks and other walkways are clear and that there's nothing obstructing it. That's 100% makes sense. But I'm wondering if we allow something else to obstruct a sidewalk, does that put this in some kind of legal jeopardy that we're making exceptions for? Like you can't put your bicycle, but you could, maybe something else would be allowed to be on the sidewalk. Could they then contest and say, well, you're not being equal?
Well, they can.
I mean, they can always.
People make a lot of work for it. That doesn't, I mean, without a specific example, that, but that doesn't concern me. I think it is fair. What you're talking about today is where does it make sense to prohibit establishing a campsite and to prohibit it in a way that would prevent the accessibility from the outset? That's reasonable.
Okay.
So,
Other things would be separate.
yeah, and we should be looking at other things too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Randy, then Alan and Mike, I've got you. And then Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you very much for putting this together. I think we're a lot closer than we were on this. Personally, I would like to see the 100-foot from top of bank apply to our all waterways, including the Amazon. So many parts of the Amazon have a steep bank. And when the rain hits human waste and other things, it just gets carried right into the Amazon, which ultimately ends up in the Willamette River. And so we still have an environmental concern that I'm worried about. I do like the sidewalk protections. I've seen that all over my ward where sidewalks are completely blocked and somebody with mobility issues just can't get from point A to point B. And it seems to me that that's a violation of the Americans for Disabilities Act. And what position does that put us in if it's blocked?
It certainly is something that we want to proactively ensure there is access.
I know Portland had litigation over that from people with mobility issues. And I just want to make sure we're trying to avoid that. Also, does this apply to sewage being released into wetlands? Again, that was another problem we had in West Eugene for a while.
Well, so I think Catherine speak to it. We have a separate provision about drainage of sewage, gray water, cesspool septic tanks into a stormwater drainage system. So
Would a wetland qualify as that?
I believe so, but I will actually check and make sure that is true. So if they're hydraulically connected to our waterways, then yes, and I believe that they're all covered by our National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit.
But you know what I'm talking about. We've had instances in West Eugene with many, many RVs, over 50. And basically the waste was dumped from the black water tanks in the RVs into 5-gallon buckets and then poured into our waterways and our wetlands rather. And that's been a concern. I just want to make sure we have the tools in place. And then I guess the main thing I'm interested in, how are we going to enforce this?
We all look at you. Well, I mean, I'll just say from a legal perspective, we would enforce it like we do all of our other code provisions. It's no different than the other offenses that we have on the books that we enforce on a daily basis, including trespass and all of those other ones. So there's nothing unique to these code provisions that would be different from when it comes from terms of enforcement.
So if a member of the public observes somebody camping in the riparian zone of the Willamette River or observes them dumping waste into a wetland, who do they report that to?
Thank you.
Good evening, Chief Skinner.
Well, we're certainly working on some options here because what we don't want is necessarily to flood our non-emergency 911 calls for service at dispatch with these types of calls, but they're important to us. A couple of things are going on. One thing that's happening over this last year is we've piloted the homeless service officers, which are 2 officers right now that are dealing with a lot of things to include oversight and support of our variety of other people throughout the city that are dealing with some of our encampments. And so our intent is as best we can to expand that team so that we have more officers that are involved in that and that kind of overwatch and to enforce some of our prohibitive camping. And so under this ordinance, this would fall under their ability to do that. The other thing that we're getting ready to do is we're getting ready to completely revamp our online reporting tool to be more robustly capturing and encouraging people to online report. Now, having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean it happens within the first 30 minutes of calling, but at least gives us the data so that we know where we're going and we can address those things. And our CSOs will be taking most of those and we can be able to push those to our housing support officers to be able to do that work. And so working with the city attorney's office, anytime we think about different code amendments or additions to code that we need to enforce, there's always the question of capacity. Do we have the capacity to enforce this? And the question is probably and robustly no, but we don't have the robust way to respond to everything in our city anyway. That doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do and give us these tools. And so we'll build the structure around that to include a more robust online reporting tool so we can convert these calls from 911, not flood that PSAP with all those calls and get them on the list for us to be able to address.
Thank you. That was part of my point. I don't want to see 911 flooded, which for the public that may be listening, the non-emergency line goes into 911. It's the same console.
Mm-hmm.
It just is a lower priority of picking that up. But city manager, I think it's going to be incredibly important that we do a public outreach campaign once we get this worked out so that people know where to report and that our website can give people that access. I know I'm constantly cutting and pasting the link to the complaint line and sending it and responding with emails. But and I'm glad to hear it's going to be reworked, even the vehicle parking one, which also covers other problems with established camps, is not real clear. And so I think making that so it's more of a general purpose, here's a problem, and we'd like to see help with that. And I'm running out of time. I don't know that I'll need a second round, but I'll reserve that.
Okay.
Right. Thank you,
I'll
Mayor.
keep you in mind. Okay, Alan and then Mike.
Picking up where Randy left off on the enforcement issue, that was one of the big things we discussed last time we were here. And 2 things about that. One, that's where the willful violations in part comes from, but and I appreciate your response. I think it's appropriate. But the willful violations part, so we're talking about people who we tell them they have to move, you're violating the code, and they don't do it. And then we come back. And so then we give them a fine of $200, and then if they still don't do it, then we give them a fine of $500 or threaten them with going to jail. Hey, we're not gonna put anybody in jail for this, so that's kind of a hollow part of this. And I guess the other part is giving and placing a fine on a person who has no income and has no ability to pay has no real effect. We once had a story that we heard a police commission about a person that had like 40 different violations, and they were just stacking up because it made no difference to that person because they couldn't pay it anyway, and they were never going to be able to pay it in their mind, so they just let them go. So I'm wondering how that plays out. And Mayor and I were talking earlier today about community court and how that might be an option for how to deal with this. I know that when we talked to the judge in several instances where we've said, we think their sanction should be X. And he said, that's not your purview. That's my purview. And I think we wanted 4 times the rate for parking violations in the university arena area. And he said, no, only 2. I get to set that, and it has to be just, and it has to be within precedents and stuff like that. So how's that whole portion going to work with the fines and potential for community court? And can we add that in here?
So,
and just one more while on this topic, how do you define willful violation?
so I'll hit that one
Start with
first.
that one.
I'll start
That's
with
the
that
easy
one
one.
because it's straight up in your code. So that's easy. It defines willful violation to mean a violation that occurs after the person has received within 30 days preceding the current violation, a citation for violating 4.815, or a written warning from a peace officer or other person authorized. So it's very clearly defined. Either they've already received a $200 violation citation, or they received a warning from a non-sworn officer. And then within 30 days, and they have the same offense within those 30 days, now it's a willful violation, and it's subject to the enhanced penalty. So,
And the 30 days is because you don't want it to be like 2 years later. We said that was
right.
It has to
Remember back when,
be pretty concurrent in time.
exactly. To get to your question regarding community court, in February, there was a decision made, including by the prosecutors. There was a discussion with Chief Skinner, Travis Smith is your prosecutor, and the court to lift the kind of geographic boundary restrictions that have been historically in place on community court and look at more of an offense-based. So all trespass 2s are actually being cited into community court now, I believe. So that would be the same thing you can do, and I would expect would happen for the a willful violation of 4.815, were that to be expanded. Citation, just a violation is different, but you can have all of these can and would be properly funneling into community court. So I would have every reason to believe that that's what you could expect to happen, because they're trying to expand the number of folks that are actually funneling into community court and that can benefit from those services. The folks that would be subject of this enforcement would absolutely be within that category. So there isn't anything that you would need to do. You'll actually have Judge Gill here on Wednesday. You could speak to him about that, but it really is also about your prosecutors and your police officers on how they're being cited and charged and all that good stuff, more than it really is Judge Gill. And I can confirm that with Travis, but I have every reason to believe that's what we would expect.
And we wouldn't need to do anything to this motion to include that.
No. You wouldn't.
Anything about the way we handle fines, Chief?
Well, I mean, the challenge is the system, and we've talked about the system for a long time. The system is not a robust system to handle any kind of accountability mechanism absent of paying the fines. And we know we don't have the jail beds as an accountability mechanism. The one thing that I would say is that the important piece of this is certainly the input into the community court that gives the judge the chance to have some restorative options to levy against individuals that are willful violators. That's really the piece for us. It's the back end of this is not something that we get overly worked up about. We do the front end. We make sure that we're doing it, fairly and equitably. and without disparate treatment. And then it gives Judge Gill or the courts an opportunity to on case-by-case basis, be able to adjust some kind of restorative measures in the event that there's a fine. So in lieu of a fine, we can do some other things. And so I like the creativity around that restorative model. I would agree with Catherine. We have often recognize that many of the people that are involved in these types of violations are people that could benefit and avail themselves of service from community court. We like that input. We like to see the numbers there. I think it's a good model. And so I'm confident that I'm actually confident that this is going to give the courts a little bit more latitude and a little more creativity on how they deliver kind of a restorative justice kind of atmosphere with handling these violations.
Yeah, good. I hope so too. I think I'd be in favor of that. Randy's question about the 60 feet versus 100 feet. Why are we making the distinction? Is that because we have it in other places like that, or it's all waters?
Yeah, so we took a look at existing code to give us a guide, and we have a number of overlays depending on where you are in the city or what state law was passed down to us to implement at the city. And looking at it, the water resources overlay zone, we have specific requirements for the Willamette River of 100 feet from top of high bank, as you see proposed in here. For the Amazon, it's 60 feet from top of high bank. There are some others, but it gets really kind of stream by stream, and we wanted to make sure it was something that could be enforceable and also that people could understand simply, right? We didn't want to get into every stream as a different offset.
Yeah,
that's why we went with 100 for the Willamette and 60 for everything else.
Because it mimics what we're already doing and it's not overly complicated. Okay. And then the 1,000 feet from educational facilities, is that from other facilities that we have?
I did not, that's not a proposal that was coming from me. If the counselor wants to speak to it, but generally what you would expect to see within, if that passes and you would like to see that in the ordinance, I would provide a definition that mirrors a state law definition or something of educational facility.
Okay.
Does that answer? I'm sorry. Is that what you were looking for, a definition of what it would be?
No, I was wondering if that was true for other types like safe sites or dusk to dawn. Are those restrictions on those?
No, there aren't any.
Aren't any? Okay. This is a new thing.
It would be new. Yep.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. I just want to ask a point of clarity, because I thought with the rest stops, there was a restriction on camping within a certain vicinity of the rest stops.
Okay. Can you, can Crispy speak to? There's one that's like specific to a lease, I believe. But I don't want to speak out of turn. Do you know the answer to
Let's
that?
just let them look it up.
They can.
Oh, they're looking it up. Fabulous.
That's fine.
I will
Perfect.
not just start.
Yeah, we'll keep going with questions, and when that comes up, thank you for just pursuing that. Okay, next up is Mike.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for all the work, everyone. I have some further questions about enforcement for the chief, but first, Catherine, I heard you use the word, and I just heard Matt say it differently, top of bank. Could you define that for me, or is that defined in code and elsewhere already?
It's defined, it's defined throughout chapter 9. And it's been litigated as it is very specifically relates to it is proposed in the proposed ordinance. It would be defined in a little bit more limited manner, because the definition in chapter 9 is like 3 provisions long. So what is being proposed for top of high bank in this ordinance would be the highest point at which the bank meets the grade of the surrounding topography, characterized by an abrupt or noticeable change from a steeper grade to a less steep grade.
And it would be a different definition to say top of high water mark as opposed to top of high bank. Is that correct?
Yes, I can speak to that. And Councilor Clark, the reason we're not using top of high water or ordinary high water mark is typically you need a resource specialist to identify that, to go out and look at the different plants that are growing in the area of the bank. And we wanted something that was easily identifiable, both, to the public, to make sure they're not violating this code provision, and to our enforcement folks to make sure they understand it. So it's an easier, go ahead.
So I was just gonna say, do you have any information on any kind of average of difference between top of bank and top of high water mark? What would be the distance difference?
Yeah, typically, so top of high water mark is not a measurement usually used. It would be ordinary high water mark, and that
Okay.
is usually much lower than the top of high bank. So if you used 100 feet from the ordinary high water mark, it would typically be less of a buffer
I got you.
than
All
what's
right.
suggested here.
Because I know that I've been out there, as Randy has and others, that when river keepers are cleaning this up, and in the fall when the rains come, the water gets considerably higher and washes quite a lot of stuff down the river. And I don't want to have anything in there that washes down the river anymore. And so I'm trying to find the language here and for an amendment, perhaps at a future point after hearing, where we make sure we don't have things washing down the river that were left by people. And I'll do that. I'll have a further conversation with you on that. My other questions are for the chief. Chief, I heard your initial comments with my colleagues' questions, but do you have any that you, if you had the choice, would add to this for the sake of your officers that's not in here? Would you address anything that's not covered in this?
So what I can tell you is that we've had very robust conversations internally with trying to capture as much of what we're seeing that's reasonable, that reasonably we can capture within an ordinance that fits within the intent of 3115 and trying to be defensible. And so I am very comfortable and pleased with the additional tools that this ordinance would give us. And I think like anything, as we evolve, we'll learn new things. We'll find new instances that may need to be addressed in the future. But for right now, I'm very, very content with where we're going with this ordinance.
Are there places where, outside of any of our established camps, are there places where it's legal to camp overnight, or does this pretty much eliminate everywhere that isn't in one of our organized camps?
I don't think this eliminates everywhere. As Catherine had said, she really built it on your 3 criteria for implementing prohibited areas.
Okay. Chief, I'm going to ask you the hard question now. We're in front of summertime where this sort of behavior tends to expand. I would love to see that people can walk down the pathways by our river and that they don't run into camps continually on the river. Do you think these changes will make the problem better, give people better tools for enforcement, and make the problem less of a problem that we get complaints about?
I'll see if I can better understand your question. So as it pertains to the camping that's happening along our rivers and waterways, this gives us the ability to, well, there's a couple of things that are going through my mind. Anytime we approach any of those camps, especially the isolated ones along the riverbank, some of them you can't even access other than by water. So that makes it challenging. And so if you're going to go in and try and enforce, you better make sure that you have the legal justification and the government interest to be in there. This allows us to do that. And then we have to build the capacity and carve out the time to be able to actually pay attention to these areas, much like we pay attention to other areas of our city that are under distress or seeing the stress of prohibited camping. And so, we'll do that. From time to time based on complaints. Oftentimes these camps are not even seen to people. And so most of these will be complaint driven from people that actually see them from a certain vantage point. Mostly the folks that are on the river notice these things. So if your question is whether or not we're going to enforce this or feel comfortable with being able to enforce this, the answer is yes. But like anything else, it's on a case by case basis.
I want to be more specific. I'm not trying to put you out there as in the lead on this to get beat up by me at all. I'm just saying this problem is so pronounced and is the biggest problem in our community. And I don't know that we have the tools to address it adequately. And so I'm searching wildly to try and find what else we might do to address this problem to at least the satisfaction of some of our residents. And I'm not even saying most, because I don't think we're close to that yet. And I'm just kind of searching about for other tools, and I will look forward to our conversations with Judge Gill. But do you think our court has the capacity to deal effectively with what our officers could do with enforcement?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, we've been having those conversations all along with what this looks like to expand this ordinance to include these other violations and what that would do to the volume of people that may be going to court. So it's kind of a wait and see type of thing. What I would suggest is, like I had said earlier, the more tools and the more opportunities for us to have justification to be able to take enforcement, then the better chance we have to be successful. And then we'll let the courts handle these on a case by case basis as they come in. To answer your question, we welcome the opportunity to be involved to solve the problem. We also are really, really mindful to say that policing this problem isn't the only answer either. So we're happy to be a part of a totality of a solution as opposed to the only solution when it comes to this.
I'm out of time, or I would have some more comments there, but thank you, Mayor.
Yeah, I can give you a second round, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay, Greg.
So Catherine, help me with this. Where did the 1,000-foot buffer around educational institutions come from? Is there like an ordinance precedent with other cities somewhere that says 1,000 feet as opposed to say 500 feet?
That was a request from a specific counselor to include that as a possibility of moving forward. I haven't done any independent research on that. It's not a proposal that was part of my recommendations. And so when the counselor gets in the queue, I don't want to speak on their behalf. When they get in the queue, they can certainly speak to that, but I apologize. I don't have any information on that. It's a counselor request.
I will say, Councilor Evans, that state statute provides for 1,000 feet of a school buffer as it pertains to certain narcotics offenses. And so that's kind of the foundational part of that conversation. When I had discussions with the counselor, I pointed that out, that we do have 1,000 feet of a school or educational facility for other types of violations codified in state statute.
Okay.
Thank you. And my apologies, because Matt was in the queue and I think this is his question, or comment. So
I have been champing at the bit to jump in. So thank you, Mayor.
Sorry.
And thank you to City Council, not the City Council, but our counselor and the chief. I appreciate collaborating with you and getting this piece around the educational facilities woven in, and I hope that there'll be a motion to the effect that embraces the proposed 1,000-foot buffer from an educational facility, which would include, I would hope, the community college here downtown and the library in particular. And as the chief mentioned, there's precedent. There's a 1,000-foot buffer from cannabis shops, from educational entities. So there's already existing state law. It wasn't a number out of thin air, and it's a number I think that the community can wrap their head around. It's around 2.5 blocks, and allow for students, allow for youngsters who want to use the library to more safely traverse through to and through the library. Moreover, our librarians are not trained or equipped to deal with the population that might be suffering substance use or acute mental health crises. What we really need, Mayor, I would posit, are significant statewide investments in critical behavioral health and stabilization centers. But I am convinced that this gives law enforcement one more tool to do their job. Chief, are there any complications you see with that proposed 1,000-foot buffer from educational facilities?
There's always, as we add more tools, it's come up a couple of times, what is our capacity to be able to robustly, you know, handle those calls for service. That would be my only concern, is that, you know, of an understanding of how quickly we can get to those. What are those prohibited behaviors are going to be important to know. Like anything, we want to do something that's defensible. But we also need to make this easy for our law enforcement professionals to be able to ascertain whether it's a violation or not.
Yep.
And we've been down the path a couple of times of trying to fix some things and making it really complex to the point where we just throw our hands up and say it's too tough in the moment to know whether it's a violation or not. And so as we have this discussion, I would encourage council to think about the simplicity in which your law enforcement professionals need to have to be able to do this fairly and even-handedly, because we certainly don't want to, you know, we don't want this to be hit and miss. And so we need to make this as simple as possible and as defensible as possible.
And is the suggested 1,000-foot simple and defensible?
It has been for us for a number of years, because we have the 1,000-foot rule in our state statute, like I mentioned earlier, and we often do, when conducting investigations, we often do 1,000-foot radius to know if something's in or out. And so, you know, we have the ability to be able to better understand whether it's in or out of the 1,000-foot. I'm not worried about the actual 1,000-foot.
Okay, great. Thank you. If I could shift to the riparian zone quickly. I'm concerned that, and by the way, staff, I want to thank you. Our original work session on this had a 5-foot buffer. I was going to propose 75 feet, and then this body suggested going back to the drawing board, and you came back with 100-foot by the Willamette and 60-foot for all other waterways. And so I thank you for that, but I would submit that for consistency's sake, because I can't imagine law enforcement out there with a tape measure. For consistency's sake, would it be easier, Chief, for your team to do their job if it was just 100 feet from any waterway?
Certainly one distance is nice for us so you're either in or you're out. We could make it work. 60 is 100 feet is really quite easy for us to determine whether you're in or out of 100 feet. The 60 foot could be a little bit more problematic without some kind of measurement around that. It's just a really strange number in our world, in most people's worlds. At 100 feet would be much easier if we got to 100 feet, quite frankly.
Okay, great, thanks. I saw my clock ticking, Mayor, but I just want to close with, I look forward to the conversation with Judge Gill, because like you, or like colleagues have expressed, I want to see us lean in as a community or as a society into the community court and public service beyond the multitude of fines that aren't going to get paid. That's the willful violations piece. But I'm convinced, colleagues, that amending the suggestion from 60 feet to 100 feet it would be more appropriate. And I hope we have full support for the educational facility piece. Thank you.
Okay, I did let you run over. So Lindsay, were you needing to be in the queue? Okay, so got Emily and then Lindsay.
Thank you. This complicated thing continues. I'm mostly interested right now in what makes a campsite, because we've changed our definition to remove bedding, sleeping bag, or anything used for sleeping. So if I'm lying down sleeping with a sleeping bag, what rules do I come under? If I put a tarp on the ground, now I'm camping because that's listed here. So how are we going to differentiate between someone who's sleeping, not at a dusk to dawn site, a permitted sleeping place, but is sleeping? Do they also have to follow these rules, not being 5 foot from the road? Or is it a free-for-all if you don't have a tent? So what is a campsite? How is it differentiated from just sleeping? If you're just sleeping, what are those rules? And also, at what point does a campsite become established?
So I'll tackle the first one, which is the definition of the campsite and versus sleeping. So somebody just sleeping in a sleeping bag under the revised definition, that is not a campsite. And so and part of it is the addition of the language. So when you have tent or tarp, lean-to shack, it is establishment or maintained for the purpose of maintaining a temporary place to live. So it's establishment of a temporary place to live versus someone just lying down and sleeping somewhere. So that is a very clear differentiation. And we've talked about and had that differentiation. What we found difficult is the addition of the terminology around bedding and sleeping bag actually made that confusing. So that's why that's being eliminated. It truly is the establishment of a temporary place to live with some sort of structure. So a lean-to, a shack, things like that. To get to your question of what is an established campsite, that is a question that is yet to be resolved by the courts. It is a very specific term within a state statute that was, and I should know it off the top of my head, I don't know the state statutory number, but it was amended by House Bill 3124. That it's been in state statutory provision for a very long time. It was originally 24 hours that if there was and they used the terminology, an established campsite, that you needed to provide notice and certain requirements of what was in that notice. It was amended by House Bill 3124 in 2021 to extend that to 72. They didn't add a definition of established campsite. So we don't have anything in statute and we don't have any case law interpreting it. There's various practices around and we've looked at what's legally defensible and stuff, but I can't just give you a clean answer.
Well, it would be nice to know what that is. I mean, out in festival land, once that tent's up and the pegs are in the ground, you're established. You know, once you turn on the stove, you're established. Till then, when it's all packed up, you're not established. So I'm kind of, just curious about this, but I'm really interested in that now that if you have a sleeping bag, you're not camping, because that's been one of the complaints over the 12 years I've been looking at this is we get moved along because we're sleeping. So is this gonna eliminate that problem? Now it's okay to sleep as long as you don't have a tarp. Because when I started, the concern was everybody needs to get a night's sleep. Can we at least sleep for the night? The question wasn't, can we put up a tent and a kitchen and all of that? That was clearly not what we were looking for. We were looking for a place to sleep. So is this going to make it easier, more complex?
Well, and it shouldn't, I would hope it doesn't make it more complex. So the elimination of the reference to bedding, sleeping bag, other materials used for bedding from the definition of campsite is very much intended to provide that clarity. We've never had a provision, and I know it gets into a discussion of semantics, that we've never prohibited sleeping. We have prohibited the establishment of campsites. And then we have in our definition of campsite references to bedding. So what this is attempting to make that very much clearer. So the elimination of that is to make it clearer that somebody sleeping is not establishing a campsite. That's not to say there are no provisions that may or may not apply otherwise. For example, within our downtown core, we have, which is an established high pedestrian area, we have wider widths. I think it's an 8-foot clear pedestrian zone. So somebody couldn't be sleeping there, but not because of a prohibited camping provision, but because of an 8-foot clear provision. So things like that.
Which there's plenty of places. I went down there with my 8-foot stick to find out where you can actually sit down there. Mm-hmm. I think this is going to be interesting, and I'm also still curious as to, this tells us where you can't camp. Get a big enough map and put all these places on it. Do we have a map of where you can and can't?
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have any real problems with the ordinance as it's written. I think we can kind of all basically agree that there are places that we don't want to see people camping. But with an understanding that people are going to camp and where can they? And I don't think that we have, Councilor Semple just brought up the idea of a map. it would help people to know, where can I find some semblance of security that I don't have to continuously day after day find somewhere to sleep, so that I can maybe access services or do something else with my time, to better my situation. I would like to see that map, not just for them, but for enforcement too. How can you understand, exactly where people are not allowed to camp, and can you guide them to a better place that they're allowed to be, rather than just ticketing and making them move along? Can we help them get to somewhere that they can be and not be in constant fight or flight moments throughout their day? And so I think I don't know where we put that in here of establishing some areas where people know that they can camp, because are we expecting our unhoused citizens to be able to read this code and understand? Or are they just going to have to wait for enforcement to tell them that they're not allowed in this place? And are we going to be able to tell them where they can go? Sort of a question.
Okay. Well, I will say, and it's not intended to sound unresponsive, but we've had all of our programs are very much intended to provide people the ability to go there. Our Dusk to Dawn and those are to say, you cannot be here, but you can be here. So those are your established programs, were your policy decisions that have been made along the years to provide those answers. Now, and what you would say is, well, it won't get at everybody. And that is true. But at the same time, there are absolutely programs in place and places where people can be recommended to go. We did, with the discussion of a map came up at your last work session, and we did have a conversation about that. But there would be no way to create such a map because, for example, one of the provisions prohibits camping within 5 feet of vehicular traffic. You would have to have mapped our entire city to know the width of planting strips and, parking areas in the middle, which we simply don't have in order to be able to map it and say, well, it's 5 feet here, so you can't camp here. It's 8 feet here, so you could camp here. So it just becomes a technical impossibility to try to just overlay these onto a city and say, so here are the places that you can.
We have a lot of different infrastructure features in our, geographical information system, our GIS system, but not things that would let you look at the width of a sidewalk and how it relates to the face of a curb. Like these things that get into the detail of when you're on the ground looking at it, how you can tell whether the ordinance would apply. So it would be very hard to come up with something that was really definitive.
If there was, you have policy. So to answer your question, would we need to build something in to provide more places? You have many programs to which you can establish more sites. I mean, those are policy decisions that you can make as a council. There's one Dusk to Dawn site. If you want to create more or want to create more programs, those are policy decisions you can make. They're not a part of this because these are intended to comply with 3115 and get that going. But those are policy decisions you've been making for 25 years. You can continue to make them.
So are there any larger areas that this applies to that could be mapped out? Like take out this little tiny stretch of a city street, or is there pieces of our land, public land, that could be, we have mapped out and designated as capable of having camping?
All of these sites are those, right? I mean, so I would say yes. I mean, there's many different teams that have spent a whole lot of time look at every piece of property that we own, every piece of property that other public agencies own that we can partner with. And that's an ongoing process to find more and more sites that we can then bring to you as a council and say, do you approve this for a microsite, for a Dusk to Dawn site, for those? So that has always been a part of the process to keep your permitted overnight sleeping programs running. It continues to be. But is there something is a part of this that we're also bringing to say, and now this piece of property, no, that's not a part of this discussion.
I totally, I would just add, I totally understand the question. It gets really super tricky because if we also attach a map that says, here's all the places you can camp, it's in the sense you're essentially establishing a rest stop without any resources or any actual intention of this is where we want people to camp, as opposed to here's where you could possibly camp. And that will be a tricky space to navigate.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for that line of questioning and for those answers. I have a few counselors in the queue, but I've just a comment about that I think it's uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable place, but to be saying you can't be here and you can't be here and you can't be here. And we're trying to create some clarity around the landscape and be in compliance with the state statute. So there's that piece. And then there's the other piece. I have been thinking all day about the fact that this council approved the creation of 500 safe sleep sites, and we're halfway there, right? And if we had the other half, that how much that could alleviate some of the pressure, and it's just finding those places and those resources to do that. So I appreciate that line of questioning, and that this council continues to be doing that work as well. But this feels like a very specific body of work that we have to address in a specific way. So just balancing that out. Okay. I guess I have Randy, Mike, and Alan in the queue for second rounds.
Thank you, Mayor. City Manager, can we talk a little bit about continuing on the conversation about where people can camp? Do we have any future rest stops in the works, and are any of them going to be dedicated towards RVs and trailers? Because we have 500 plus sites right now, only 55 of them, is my understanding, they're available for RVs and trailers. And we still have a lot of those out there. And I recognize they are the hardest to accommodate because they take up a lot more space than just a regular campsite. And there's certain fire hazards. They frequently catch on fire and do burn, and you can't have them too close to each other, or you have collateral damage and exposures. So anyway, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think honestly, I think a couple of weeks ago, we opened the Chase Commons site, which is for the medically fragile. And I believe that is the last piece of real estate we identified for a future site of all the ones we've been looking at, but it's an ongoing process. So I
believe that's correct. Christy might be able to speak to it as well, but we have talked about expansion of some existing sites, the Every One Village site being one. I'm not sure offhand if some of that additional capacity would be for vehicles. Christy might be able to speak to that.
Councilor Groves, I think that there's an interest in continuing to pursue the option for RVs and more car camping sites. But what we're really trying to do right now is sustain what we have and minimize expansion right now until we have ongoing stable funding identified before we add too much that we can't sustain past the next year or year and a half. And so, but it's definitely a priority for us because we recognize the need. And there have been some community members that have expressed that interest as well. So.
Well, I appreciate that. I figured that was probably the answer, but I think it's important for the public to understand we do have limitations. As I like to frequently say, we have a metro city-sized problem, a metro city-sized challenge, and we're trying to address it with a small to medium-sized city budget and level of staffing. And so we're always going to fall woefully short of what I think the majority of the public would like to see us be able to accomplish. But this is a big part of our budget deficit this year, and we're going into a big hole where services are going to be impacted. And this situation doesn't help with it. At the same time, it's here. We have to deal with it. We have to find ways of addressing it. And I hope as we go forward, I'm certainly in support of this work and trying to protect sensitive areas and, you know, people that would be vulnerable to some of the exposures that they would be exposed to. But at the same time, I think we also have to be able to have places for people to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to tag on to the end of the chief's comments when he and I were last conversing there by saying that I agree entirely with the chief's comments that community court is an intelligent and a very wise way for us to deal with this issue. It can have the effect of holding people accountable for decisions and at the same time do so in a more humane way and more effective way. And I think it's a good thing that we're doing it. I think that establishing the camps that we are is also a good thing in that it provides some alternatives for people. Here's the other face of that coin for me is that I think, in my opinion, we lean very, very hard on alternative solutions of this nature, and at the same time enable people in the process to make bad decisions because of the way we discuss this. It's my opinion. I am entirely for the idea that the city has a role to help people who want to get well, who need some help. That many of the services in the community court aspect of how we deal with some of this is designed intelligently to help people and all the service providers that are available in those places that we have organized. I think those are very good things. And the city has a role and should help people who want to get well. But I think we don't often recognize that there is a population of people who don't want to get well and they don't want to follow rules. And I think our stance enables them to stay stuck in that place too often. So, and as a result, it gives us a problem that is higher per capita than almost any place else in the country. And I think we need to do even more different things in order to make a dent in that. And I think our city and the residents here expect us to. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Alan?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I really don't like the idea of a map of where you can camp. If we had a map of all of that and it would be perceived as these are sanctioned places where people could camp. And if your property is proximate to that, you think you get a lot of phone calls and emails now about this issue, which we do. The phones and your email will blow up. And I think the better way to do that is point to and push people towards the established sites that we have that we have about the rules and the sanitation and the garbage and bolster those. We're halfway there in terms of getting where we want to go. One of the things I brought up last time was that while if you don't have a trespass letter filed with the city on the front of your property in the right of way, with a trespass letter, the cops can come and ask that person to leave your right of way. So I encourage everybody who's listening that has that issue. I talked to a father the other day and he ended up getting a trespass letter because they were just camping in the front yard, basically. So get a trespass letter. On the 100-foot, 60-foot setback, I tend to want to have codes be consistent. And the fact that we have already an existing 100-foot for the Willamette and 60-foot for other places, in particular the Amazon, which I was most concerned about, that makes sense to me. I don't think it's that much more complicated than only one. The cops could pace off 20 strides to figure out where 60 feet is, just as they could with 30 or 40 strides to get to 100 feet. But so I would tend to want to keep our things consistent. So the 60 and 100 makes sense because it already exists. On the education 1,000-foot buffer, I'm interested in hearing what people have to say about that. Did we find out what it was for if rest stops or anything else?
Thank you, Jackie.
So the current rest stop code does not specify a specific amount of distance. It is more focused on the city's ability to mitigate the impacts of that. So as part of the proposal, when you bring forward a site, you sort of bring forward the whole site plan. And the expectation within code is that it accompany the ways in which the city would mitigate impacts. So it doesn't specify a finite footage.
And really the one place we have that is around drugs and narcotics.
For 1,000 feet.
Fine, and I'm worried about that perception about equating homeless camps with that. While there are people with substance abuse, mental health abuse, I don't think that's warranted to go that way. But I would like to hear what people say about it when they come to the public hearing. Are all 6 of the bullet points that were in our last attachment A, they had all those listed bullet points, are all those embedded in the language?
100%.
Okay. And then finally, this is not, I know this is kind of scary for some people because it's kind of a little bit amorphous, but it's not a free for all. You can't just camp anywhere and you want. It's only public lands. It's not our parks because they're already closed to the public in the evening. So you can't be in there, period. So it does comply with what the court said, but it's not going to be a free for all. And I don't think it's going to increase our homelessness problem. It's just going to regulate it differently.
Thank you. I have Jennifer and then Lindsay for second rounds.
Yeah, thank you. So I can understand why there would be hesitation to have a map, which sounds like it's not even really possible anyway. But it also sounds a little bit about like security through obscurity, like pretending like people won't figure out where these spots are seems a little naive. And that if we just keep them to ourselves, we're somehow making things better. I mean, personally, I would want to know if there was a site from either side, whether it was trying to find a place to sleep and to live, because I wanted some security to be able to get to my job and be able to, you know, have a place, or if I worked or lived next to a sizable chunk that might become one of these spaces, and what I might do to prepare, or I don't know. I just think sticking our heads in the sand and pretending we don't know where they are isn't necessarily helpful in the long run. I don't have a solution. I also don't think like publishing a map of here's where you should go is necessarily the full way to go. But I don't know. I feel like being prepared is better than pretending we can't know where these things are, at least larger chunks that might become camps. I mean, my memory of Camp 99 was not good, and I would hate to see situations of like that propping up in our community, which is where we get a lot of our complaints, obviously. I don't know. It just seems like we should be prepared.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you. Yeah, I can abandon kind of the idea of this full-fledged map that I think we have in our heads, but some kind of user guide, something to simplify what we're saying in code so that people can understand. We have to face reality. We have people camping next to people's houses already. You take a walk in the Whitaker, along the train tracks, along Train Song. We have a lot of people who are unhoused neighbors, and we have to give them an ability to camp somewhere that they can camp. So however we do that, however we get the word out, I just want it to be clear that they should have this ability. People are, in the neighborhoods, and they are getting compassion fatigue around having people camping all around them all the time. And they're helping these people and they're trying to do what's best for them, but they're getting frustrated. And so if we can say, we have a place for you, because all the safe sleep sites, the rest stops, for the most part, they're full, and they require some things that not everybody has yet. So we need a very broad spectrum of places for people to be, all the way up from, the mission where they're like, I have a life-changing program and you have to commit to this program. It's very successful, all the way down to, yes, you can camp here. And yes, a map, I understand the complications with that, but how can we allow people to get out of that, emotional dysregulation because they're so fearful of all of their stuff being taken constantly? That's all I'm asking, is to get this information to those people in a way that makes sense.
Okay, Emily and then Matt.
Thank you. When I mentioned the map last time, I was not thinking that the city would prepare this map and distribute it. I was thinking that if I was outside looking for a place I could sleep, just even it was just for the night, I know how to get a big map and some colored pencils and figure it out. And if I was looking, if I didn't have a job and I had this time, I would be making maps and selling them on the corner. So no, I don't think the city's getting ready to show you where there's an extra 3 feet. But somebody's gonna. So the problem's gonna still be there. It's gonna be confined to these places that we put the parameters on. That right now it's kind of amorphous, so we can pretend, oh, it's all protected, just our sanctioned sites. But we are putting down lines as to where we're gonna come after you and where we won't. So we want to make sure that we're okay with where those lines are.
Okay, Matt.
Thank you, Mayor. Through my work on the Human Services Commission, I've long argued for more public-facing places where people can go. And places they can call, websites they can visit, whether it's 211, or a list of authorized, sanctioned, safe sleep sites, rest stops, dusk to dawn, you name it, with our service providers' contact information available as well. Problem, if you're unhoused and you're living not day to day, hour to hour, you often don't have access to the proper communication tools. So I get the longing for providing some tangible direction, and maybe that's an informational card. Don't know what that would look like, but it's an intriguing concept. But I don't want that to hold up the work, but I really appreciate the suggestion. In regards to the riparian piece, I would argue that 100 foot across the board would be that consistency would be more clear, both to the community and to our law enforcement partners. And finally, looking at the 3 buckets, the accessibility bucket, the public health bucket, and the safety bucket that informed and directed this work, our schools have to be accessible. And if parents throughout this municipality, especially in my ward, time and again, I hear there are drug deals happening or there's questionable activity around Roosevelt Middle School. That middle school has to be accessible to parents. And I don't know a family in Eugene that wouldn't say thank you when they learned that council was advancing a proposed 1,000-foot buffer of unauthorized camping around an educational facility. That's just 2.5 blocks. Public health, the safety and well-being of our community, and the accessibility of our schools, our educational facilities, is why I reached out to staff and to the city manager's office and to the chief to get the language in front of you. It's paramount. We get asked day in and day out to do something. And at the same time, we need to be saying there are places you can go. We need to be asking the state for greater resources and investments. I applaud and appreciate that we're halfway to our safe to our goal. We need far more, but our schools and the pathways to our schools need to be accessible. They need to be safe. And that's why I strongly urge the ordinance language in front of us and urge that we have a public hearing about the matter at the May 15th meeting. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that. So we have the council president has 2 choices, and one is to move forward and one is to give an option for some of these other things to be added. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor. We'll see where this goes. I move to direct the city manager to schedule a public hearing on the draft ordinance set forth in attachment A with the following additions. 1, camping restriction on public property located within 1,000 feet of an educational facility. 2, extending the prohibition camping zone for what is classified as other waterways to 100 feet top of bank. 3, clarify that wetlands are protected areas with regard to camping and dumping.
Second.
I'm not done yet. And schedule a public hearing.
Second, the willful violation part.
Did you include the willful violation?
I don't think I did, darn it.
Didn't.
That's this.
And 4,
I withdraw my second, Kelly.
There you
okay,
go.
thank you. You want me to start over again?
Yeah, why don't you do the, well, yeah, do the 4 again. It's.
No. Okay, I'm going to go through the whole thing again, just so it's clear.
Okay.
Thank you for catching that. Move to direct the city manager to schedule a public hearing on the draft ordinance set forth in attachment A with the following additions. 1, a camping restriction on public property located within 1,000 feet of an educational facility. 2, extending the prohibited camping zone for what is classified as other waterways to 100 feet top of bank. 3, clarify that wetlands are protected areas with regard to camping and dumping. And move to direct the city manager to add the proposed ordinance an amendment to EC 4.990 sub 8, making the penalty and process for willful violation applicable to any violation of EC 4.815, not just vehicular camping violations.
Second.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Are there comments or questions or anyone wanting to speak to any of that? Doesn't look like it. All right, we ready for a vote in that case? All in favor of the proposed motion, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Have I got all 8? Yes, that passes unanimously. Thank you very much. I think that's great. Good work and a great conversation. Thank you all. And we are adjourned.